So today we're looking at day 4. This is going to be Introduction to Biomechanics. So we've got 2 days of terms here. We've got today and we've got Monday. Monday's a little gentler, but today is just like a lot of terms. It's going to feel like it's many terms. And this is really like where we are discussing, the reason we have so much terminology is because we need to have kind of a specific language to speak so that it takes all the guesswork out. Like if I were to say like raise your arm up, right? That could be interpreted in a couple different ways, right? You could raise your arm up like this. You could raise your arm up like this, right? You could do it with your palm facing the other direction. There's a lot of ways to raise your arm up. But if I said perform shoulder flexion is this, right? And if I said perform shoulder abduction is this. And so because we have like more language to speak, we can be much more specific about how we instruct and understand our movements. Now, you're not going to tell your clients like, okay, you're going to do abduction. You know, you're not going to tell them that. But when we start getting to the second half of this class, where we start labeling our muscles, when we get into the labeling part of things, and I start saying, you know, this muscle is the agonist for, you know, this type of movement. We need to make sure that like we know what that movement is specifically versus like raising the arm, right? What's up, Noel? How you doing?
All right, what's going on?
Oh, you know, another day. So we're just talking about how we're going to learn a lot of terms today. We're going over a lot of biomechanical terms. And so, you know, if I said, you know, you get 3 heads to your deltoid. The shoulder's so good for this because the ball and socket joint. So it's great for examples. So you get your anterior deltoid, you get your medial deltoid, and you get your posterior deltoid, right? So those are 3 sort of different heads, right? So each of them actually pull it in different directions. So your anterior deltoid is in charge of shoulder flexion. Your medial deltoid is in charge of abduction, and your posterior deltoid is in charge of horizontal abduction is what it's called. And so they do different movements, right? Each of them does like a different thing. And so because they do a different thing, right, that way I don't have to say, raise your arm, right? All right, what I can say is, you know, activate your anterior deltoid. And you're gonna know what I'm referring to is shoulder flexion, right? So the reason we have all these terms is because we are about to start, you know, memorizing a lot of different muscles that do different movements. Then we need to understand that those movements are very particular. And if we don't all speak the same language, we can't, you know, really understand this on a deep level. So the purpose of this lecture is to, you know, give you a fundamental overview of the language of terminology of how the human movement system produces that movement. So we want you to be able to describe some biomechanical terminology. We want you to understand your planes of motion, joint motions, muscle actions, and how all those things kind of relate to our movement. So what we're really discussing, you know, in the end is biomechanics, right? Biomechanics is the science concerned with the internal and external forces and how they act on the body. So it's basically like biomechanics is how we describe how our bodies work in this world, you know, how they interact with the outside world. And so it's the motions that your kinetic chain produces and all the forces that are actually like, you know, acting on it. And so when we look at anatomic terminology, this is a little bit of a different term. Like biomechanics is talking about movement. Anatomic terminology is a specific language that uses, that we describe locations, right? And that again is going to allow us for effective communication. So anatomic terminology is saying something is superior and something is inferior. Something is medial versus something is lateral. And so like those terms are really important to understand, particularly more in like other medical fields. Like, don't get me wrong, anatomic locations are still very important for us as well. But you know, like if you were like a surgeon, you don't want someone to say like, oh, it's in their stomach. And then like a surgeon goes around searching in your stomach. You know, they would want you to say like, oh, it's in the anterosuperior portion of the stomach, which means that it's stuck in the front upper part of the stomach. And it's like, okay, great, we can look straight there. So that's a little more like medical, but it is still something we are going to use because, you know, we're going to be looking at, so like, let's just take a look here. I'm just going to pull up let's see, let's just pull up, let's go with quadriceps. So let's look at the quadriceps group here. So if you look at your quadriceps, right, you can see these are different muscles. You've got these three, what are called your vastus muscles, or you can sometimes we'll call them the three vasti muscles. So you've got your vastus lateralis, right? So that's lateral. It's named after like where it is, right? It's lateral. It's on the outside of the body. But then you've got your vastus medialis, and that one's medial. That's on the inside of the body. Then you get your vastus intermedius, which you actually can't really see here. They got like a little dotted line here drawn. And it runs between the lateralis and the medialis. That's why it's intermedius, it's inter to middle. And so you'll notice like those are your three sort of quadriceps muscles. And they originate on the greater trochanter of your femur. So they attach from the top of your femur right over here, and then they run down and they insert onto the superior anterior portion of your tibia. And so that means that if you've got like, if you picture these muscles and you picture like where they are, it's running from here down over top of my kneecap and inserting on here, which means if it were to pull, right, it would do this. And that's how we know that the quadriceps are in charge of knee extension, right? So by understanding like their locations and things like that, we understand that like their function is to perform knee extension. But then look at this really big one over top, right? Look at this huge rectus muscle right here, right? It isn't originating on the femur. It's actually originating up here on the pelvis, which I guess is kind of cut off in this picture. Bigger picture. Okay, well there's all the friggin', yeah, you can kind of see them there. So see the rectus femoris is starting up here just below your ASIS. So it's actually starting on the pelvis and it inserts into the same spot. So what's funny about that, right, is like these three quadriceps muscles, the three vasti ones, they're only in charge of knee extension. That's all they do because of where they attach. They run from the femur, right? They run from the leg onto the lower portion of the leg. But your rectus femoris runs from your hip and inserts onto the same spot. So the rectus femoris does both knee extension. It's assisting in knee extension just like the quadriceps muscles is, but it also has a secondary job, which is to perform hip flexion as well. Because it's attached to my hip, it can do both this and it can do this, right? And so that's a muscle that has two jobs. And we know that because of like how it's connected, and we understand like this terminology. And that way, you know, when I'm telling you where something is and when I describe where it is on a bone, if we all speak this language, I don't have to say it's on the top part of the bone, right? I can say it's on the superior medial part of the bone, right? And so you would know that that means that it's above and slightly towards the midline. So that's why anatomic terminology is kind of so important for us. And you know, once you get the terminology down, it's like speaking the alphabet, you know? Like if you had like a really hard, you know, English test back in high school, but imagine if you were in high school or college and you were taking, you know, some type of English and, you know, you on that test, you know, normally you had to like answer a lot of questions like vocab, right? Like vocabulary questions where it was just like some word, you know, some big long word like you had to define and spell anti-disestablishmentarianism, right? Like, that's my favorite silly word. And what it means is it is protesting protesters who are protesting religion. Anti-disestablishmentarianism. So it's protesters protesting protesters. So anyway, imagine if like on that test where you have this really hard question, right, that you have to spell, you also were like, describe to me what all the vowels are, you know, and you had A, E, I, O. That's an easy question, right? Well, it seems easy because we're just so used to using them, right? That's where I want you guys to get with anatomic terminology. I want to use this anatomic terminology and ask, you know, you're going to have advanced questions related to it, but you're also going to get some simple questions, which are like, what is you know, the head is blank compared to the rest of the body. And you'll know that because the head is above, you know that it means superior. Which once you have the terminology down, that's a snowball question, right? Like that's the easiest question in the world. Seems a little daunting at first when you have to get all this terminology down. But trust me, once you learn how to talk the talk, it is a piece of cake. So let's go ahead and look at one term here that we definitely also need to remember. So if we are going to speak this new language, right, and we are going to kind of be very, very specific about how we label where things are on the body, we all have to have the same starting point for the body. And that is where what is called the anatomic or anatomical position comes in. And when I say anatomical position, what I mean is like when I say like something is elbow flexion and something is elbow extension, we know that it's happening from this one specific position in the body. Doesn't matter what position you are in currently. If you are moving in elbow flexion, right, you are moving, I am referencing from this one specific position. And what that position is it is, you can't see my toes, but they are pointing straight forward. So it is feet shoulder width apart, palms at your sides with your palms facing forward. This is the anatomic position. So when I say something is elbow flexion, I am referring to this movement right here. So if I were to do it from up here, right, that's still elbow flexion. It doesn't change what it is because you would unfold the body to this position, and that's the position that I'm referencing it from. So the anatomic position is the position with the body standing at the arms at your sides with palms facing forward, and that is a standard spot. Oh, I got a picture. That is a standard spot from which we describe all of these things. So if you were upside down, right? If you were like standing on your hands and if you were doing a handstand, your head is still considered superior because I'm not referring to the position you're in currently. I'm referring to the anatomic position, and the head is the most top portion thing on the body. It is as superior as it gets, right? Whereas your feet are the most inferior thing. They're the lowest thing on the body. Whether you're standing on your hands, laying on your side, or whatever, it doesn't matter. I'm referring to you in this position, okay? So we have a standard version. This also is what takes away, this is where this conversation gets really specific. So I don't have any in this current call, but like I'll tell you one thing about like teaching for a living, and I was totally this student as well. You guys will remember, you're probably doing this at some point, like at least once. I feel like everybody does it at least once. You probably remember this person in school who, like, you know, whenever the teacher says something, they go, well, technically, you know, or they go, well, what about this, you know? That's like a classic thing. So it's funny, one thing that I always get into, and I feel like it's always a small argument, is when I get into the rotations, right? So you've got what is called internal rotation and you've got external rotation. So if I'm in the anatomic position and I describe internal shoulder rotation, that is going to rotate my shoulder toward my midline. And external rotation is me rotating my shoulder away from the midline. So if my arm was like this, right, and I rotated like that or that, doesn't matter. I'm referring to this position. So you'll get people who go, well, it's a circle, so you can't really say it's internal because I'm like, what the definition for internal rotation is it's a rotary movement toward the midline, right? And external rotation is a rotary movement away from the midline. And people love to go, but technically, because it's a circle, part of the circle is moving internal, but there's part of it that's moving external. And it's like, nope, that argument is null and void because I know the starting point of that circle. And that starting point is the anatomic position. So I know where the circle starts and where the circle ends. It is not an infinite circle. So that argument is void. And that's why this terminology is so important. I love to use that as an example because it really shows you, like, when we have a very clear starting point, it takes away arguments like that. It takes away, there's no room for interpretation. We all mean the same thing. And that's great, right? That means that we can't, argue about like, well, I think it's this way. And it's like, nope, Science says it's this way. We labeled it years ago. All right. There is one other term you'll sometimes see, which is called the fundamental position. That's this position here with your arms. It's exactly the same, except the arms are not in this kind of awkward position here. They're just kind of resting like they normally would. Like the way you normally stand, that's the fundamental position. That's not a super important term, but it is sort of one that sometimes exists. All right, so now let's get these terms in, right? So this is actually, I think, the picture from your textbook. But this is what we're talking about when we say anatomic locations, right? So anatomic locations are how we label the specific parts of the body. They describe our landmarks, right? So you've got superior, which is a position above any other point of reference. You've got inferior, which is a position below any other point of reference. You've got anterior, which is on the front of the body. Posterior, which is on the back of the body. You've got proximal, which is nearer to the middle of the body, not midline, but middle. And then distal, which is farther from the middle of the body. And you see down here, you've got medial, which is closer to the midline of the body, lateral, which is farther from the midline of the body. Then you got like ipsilateral, which means it's on the same side of the body as something else. So like your left hand and your left foot, they're ipsilateral to each other. But then you have contrary, you got contralateral, and that is your left hand and right hand. They're on opposite sides of the body. So that's good enough, right? Let's move on. No. All right, let's go ahead and go over these really quickly, right? So your anatomic locations, right? Their job is they're terms that describe specific landmarks on the body. So superior, right? Superior refers to a position above a point of reference. So here's some examples here, right? Your head, right, is above your sternum, which is your breastbone, right? So your head is considered superior to the breastbone. It's also considered superior just in general because it is above the midline of the body. So your midline is going to be like right here and right here, right? And so because it's above this midline, everything from here up is considered superior and everything from here down is considered inferior, if you don't give another point of reference. But if you give another point of reference, like if I said, like, you know, my sternum is superior in general, but if I said my sternum compared to my head, now suddenly this is superior and this is inferior. So superior is a position above a point of reference. Your femur is superior to your tibia, right? Your thigh is superior to your shin. Your pectoralis major is superior compared to your abdominals, right? Your pecs are above your abs. Then we've got inferior, which is a position below a point of reference. And that, by the way, actually, guys, when you are first learning this kind of stuff, this is one of the tricks. Memorize them in pairs. Memorize, you know, Batman and the Joker, right? Learn your opposites. Your opposites are going to help you sort of understand the original versions a little bit more deeply. Like, I'm a big board game guy. Does anybody in here ever play Catchphrase? Does ever play the game Catchphrase?
No, I never heard of that game.
Really? Oh, it's great. It's so fun. It's where you're on a team and you're trying to get them to say a certain word, but you're not allowed to say what that word is. So like if I wanted you, like if the word I wanted you to get was like Superman, you know, I'd probably go something really obvious. I'd say like, it's Clark Kent's alter ego, you know, or he's the main character in DC Comics. Yeah, I'd say something like that. But what I could also do is I could say the opposite of Superman. I could say like the opposite of Superman. I totally said Superman. The opposite of Lex Luthor is, and then you would say, you know, you'd figure it out. So opposites are super, super, super helpful way of memorizing this material. All right, so superior is a position above a point of reference. Inferior is a position below a point of reference, right? And so like if we talk about your feet, right? Your feet are below your belt, so they are inferior. Your heel bone is inferior to the patella, right? It's below your knee bone. Your calf muscle is inferior to the hamstring complex. It's below it, right? So when I'm talking about superior and inferior, one thing you need to also keep in mind is that it's like an elevator. It only moves up and moves down. So like, I'm only referring to like, is it below something or is it above something? Like in the example I just gave, right? Like your patella is your knee bone. That's on the front of your body. Your calcaneus, that's your heel bone. That's on the back of the body. So, you know, your heel bone is definitely below your knee, but it is also behind your knee. So technically there's going to be other terms there. But if we're just talking about like superior, inferior, we're just talking up and down. We don't have to talk about how it is also posterior compared to the knee bone. We just need to say the one thing at first until we need to get more specific. So superior and inferior only refer to the vertical part. There's no other assumptions that are made there. Now, you do have two terms here that are sometimes, these are the two I'd say that are most confusing. These are the ones that usually people have a little bit of a harder time with, but you've got proximal and distal. Proximal is going to be, it refers to a position nearest the center of the body or nearest another point of reference. So when I say it's near the center of the body, I'm not just talking about your midline. I am talking about both of your midlines, right? So if we look at like anatomic terminology, give me one with arrows. Okay, show me midlines. Close. Okay, there we go. That'll work. So you see how there's too much going on here. Let's see here. Planes of motion. That'll work. Okay. So you see this body here and how it's being intersected like down the middle here and down the middle here, right? The point where those two places meet, if no point of reference is given and you are using the term proximal or distal, you're referring the closest to that midline. So you're talking about the left-right midline and the up-down midline, right? So right where those two things meet, if something is close to that, we call it proximal. So it's within proximity, right? Versus distal, which is a position farther from the center of the body or farther from a point of reference. And that is something that is, you know, at a distance. So proximal within proximity, distal at a distance, right? And so your eyes, right, they are more proximal compared to your, oh, I'm sorry. I was like, that's not true. There's more to the sentence. Your eyes are more proximal to your nose than your ears are, right? So your eyes are closer to your nose. So I gave a second point of reference there, right? Than my ears. So if you give like, when you're using proximal and distal, you'll often use 3 points of reference. It'll be the one that you're referring to. Then you'll give it an in reference to something else, and then compared to a third thing. So your eyes are proximal to your nose compared to your ears, right? Like this is closer to this if you compare it to this. But the most proximal thing that you've got is going to be your nose. It's close to this midline, and it's also, you know, closer to the midline down here. So the most proximal thing would be the nose in this scenario, if no other reference point is given. So proximal is closer to general, and distal is further from. So your fingers are more distal than your wrist, right? So your fingers are farther away compared to your wrist, right? This is closer to get back to the center of your body. And that's where we most often use the terms proximal and distal. Most of the time, like I said it on my face, most of the time you're not really going to be referring to the face. Most of the time you're going to be referring to your arms and legs. That's where we most often use proximal and distal, because like, you know, your arms kind of sit at a weird angle, your legs are kind of unique in their shape and stuff. They got multiple bones and things like that. So because of like those characteristics, proximal and distal become really handy on the arms and legs, because like you want to think of it almost like a highway, right? Like I've got to get a car to travel all the way back to my center. So my elbow is proximal compared to my wrist, right? But my shoulder is proximal compared to my elbow. This is closer than this. This is closer than this. This is closer than that. So in these scenarios, it becomes really handy when you're talking about the arms and legs to use proximal and distal. Proximal is like whatever's going to get you back to the center of the body fastest. Distal is whatever's going to get you back to the center of the body the slowest, right? So the lumbar spine, your low back, is more proximal to the tailbone than the sternum is, right? So my lumbar spine here is closer to my tailbone right here than my sternum is, right? Which is all the way up here. And so it is within proximity to the sacrum. My sternum, though, is more distal to the sacrum, so it's farther away from the sacrum than my lumbar spine is. So we flipped it around there. And again, this one, you want to picture kind of an escalator, right? So superior inferior, that is just vertically, but proximal distal can go in any direction, like an escalator, right? It can go in whatever direction it wants to go to. It is not shackled by only up-down movement. It is also, you know, all different planes of motion. It can move this way and that way and this way, go wherever it wants to go. And I think that's why those terms tend to be a little bit harder. So like, I'll do one more example here, just for proximal and distal. Picture like a circle, right? Here's your center of that circle, right? So if you put 2 points, right? These look somewhat similar in terms of how far away they are, but like, let's say we measure it and we'll say that this one is 18 inches, right? And this one's just slightly closer at 17 inches. This would be proximal, and this one would be distal. It's just whatever is closer to the midline, okay? So I'm starting to, I went on a gift kick a few months ago. Now I feel like I'm going on a paint kick. So let's go ahead and take a look at our other anatomic locations like anterior and posterior. So anterior is where you were talking about the front of the body. Posterior is where you're talking about the back of the body, right? So a position on the front is anterior. That is like your palms, right? Now I would say my palms are anterior compared to the rest of the body. And some people will go, wait a minute, no, like my palms are on my inside. Yeah, most of the time. Most of the time when you're standing around, you're right. Your palms are facing inwards. But remember, all of these points of reference, every single one of them is from the anatomic position. So the palms are considered to be on the front of the body. They are anterior, whereas the back of your hand is considered posterior because we're always referring to everything from the anatomic position. So your quadriceps, right? They are on the anterior part of your thigh, and your hamstrings are on the posterior part of your thigh, right? So anterior on the front, right? The palms, and posterior, your gluteus maximus, right? That's why, did anybody else's mom do this? My mom, you know, she never wanted to like, you know, curse in public, but she would always like threaten to whip my posterior. Because I had a lot of energy. So that's your anterior and posterior. Now you've also got medial and lateral, right? So, you know, going back to sort of looking at the front of the body again, you've got medial, which is moving in this direction. This is picture like a, you know, we had an elevator, right? We moved up and down. We had an escalator, which moved at angles. Now we've got one of those weird moving sidewalks at airports that can only move side to side. And so that's where you get medial and lateral. So medial is closer to the midline of the body, not the center of the body, just the midline of the body. And then lateral, which is further from the midline of the body, right? So superior, inferior, lateral, medial, right? And so medial is closer to that midline. Your adductors, that's your inner thigh muscles, right? So your adductor complex is the inner thigh right in here near the groin, are on the medial side of the thigh because they are closer to the midline. Your sternum, right, is medial compared to like, it's the most medial thing in your body, right? Your heart is very medial. It pretty much sits dead center there. And so that's the medial portion. Then you got lateral, which is referring to a position farther from the midline, so outside of the body, right? And so your shoulders are lateral compared to your sternum. Your ears are like the most lateral part of your head. So again, you've got like an elevator for superior and inferior. You've got an escalator going kind of side to side at an angle for proximal or distal. And you've got a moving sidewalk for medial and lateral. Then we've got just a couple more that are kind of special terms. Those are like the actual location terms. We got a couple special terms here at the end. You've got contralateral, which is like contra means like, oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I got a quick question. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, I love questions.
What's the difference between medial and lateral and posterior and distal? Because they're kind of the same, right?
You mean proximal and distal?
Oh yeah, proximal and distal. I'm sorry.
Yes, they are really, really similar. Proximal and distal can go in any direction. Medial and lateral are stuck moving like this, right? But proximal and distal can go like in any, I don't know what I'm doing. They can go in any direction they want to go. So let's go back. I'm going to go back to the circle thing here, right? So let's see here. I'm going to do a better job this time by drawing a circle like that, which I thought of after I did it. Let's make this a little thicker. Okay, so here's this, and then I'm going to make a really thin line here. That, and then, okay, so that wasn't the perfect center. Okay, and then I brush, thick one. Okay, so there's the perfect center of the circle, right? So medial and lateral can only go like this. They're tied to this line. Now this line can move up and down, right? Medial and lateral could be up here, right? Like if you had a spot here and you had a spot here, right? This is still considered medial and this is still considered lateral, right? So it can be both, right? This is also closer to this dot here than this one is. So this would be medial. It could also be considered proximal. But if I said medial, I would look basically directly to one. I'd look, on this plane, like straight to the side, right? So then superior and inferior, they can only move up and down, right? So like this is superior compared to this, right? Because this is above and this is below. This is inferior, this is superior. But proximal and distal could be like if you had a point here and you had a point here, right? This is both, like this is on the lateral side, so is this, but this is more close to the center. So it is within proximity, it's proximal, right? So proximal and distal refer to like, they can go in both directions. So proximal and distal aren't really designed to like replace superior, inferior, medial, or lateral. It's just used to refer to like a combination of the both, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, when you said that last part, a combination of the both, that makes sense now.
Cool. Yeah. And that's the thing. That's why we kind of only refer to it as like, oftentimes the most often place we are going to use proximal and distal is talking about the arms, because you're trying to get back to the center, right? In superior inferior, I'm just trying to move up and down this line, and I'm looking at this other line. Am I above this line or am I below this line? In medial and lateral, I'm moving only along this line, and I'm trying to get back to the midline here. But proximal and distal, I'm not trying to get back just to the midline. I'm trying to get back to both midlines. I'm trying to get back to the center. And that's kind of the difference. When a lot of times we replace, like that's the difference between middle and center. They're not the same thing. They sound similar, right? But they're technically kind of like center is middle this way and middle this way. Whereas like middle is just one or the other. So does that help?
Yeah, I just got to think of things on a parallel and perpendicular plane a lot.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's like I said, we mostly use it when we are talking about the body. Like I don't even necessarily have to give you 3 points of reference. If I use proximal distal, I can only give you 2, and that's enough, right? Like my elbow is proximal compared to my wrist. This is proximal compared to this because this gets me back to center faster. This gets me sent back to center slower. Think of proximal and distal as like if you had to measure it in inches, like how many inches away is it from your center? Whichever one is farther away is distal, whichever one is closer is proximal. Okay, so our special terms, our weird ones, are going to be contralateral and ipsilateral. Contra means, you know, like you're contradicting someone or it's contrary, it's opposite, right? And so contralateral refers to a position on the opposite side of the body. So your right hand is contralateral to your left hand, you know? This on my own, right? Like total opposite sides. Then you got ipsilateral, right? Ipsilateral refers to a position on the same side of the body. So like, you know, right hand, right foot. This becomes important sometimes because we'll often describe doing like a single-sided exercise and you'll hold the dumbbell in your contralateral hand. So like if I did, you know, like a single leg Romanian deadlift, right? Which is this motion right here, right? I would hold a dumbbell, you know, I've got my right foot down. I would hold a dumbbell in my left hand, and I'd probably just keep my other hand back here just to make sure that my low back's safe, or I could hold it on my hip. And then I would take that down and I would do it like this, right? So that's, I hold it in the, sometimes that's the only time you'll hear the word contralateral. You'll say, you hold the dumbbell in the contralateral hand. The reason we do that, by the way, the reason we hold it in the opposite side is because that keeps your body in balance. If you hold it on the same side, what people will do naturally is they'll want to open up their hip and lean like this. We want their neutral pelvis, we want their pelvis to move like this, not like this. So that's kind of a fun, that's a bonus. We're gonna get into that when we get to the lumbopelvic hip day. So that's contralateral and ipsilateral. And then last 2 definitions we've got for our location definitions, prone and supine. Prone is a position laying face downwards. So if you sleep on your stomach, you sleep in a prone position. And supine is if you sleep on your back, you are in a supine position, right? If you're a back sleeper. So prone is a position face down, supine is a position face up. Honestly, I mean, we do use those terms. I shouldn't say. I was about to say we don't really use these terms that often, but that's totally not true. But what you will often see instead of prone and supine is you will see pronated and supinated. And so like your palms, you can rotate them like this. You can rotate them face up and you can rotate them face down. This face up position, right? That is supinated, and the face down position is pronated, right? So laying on your stomach, face down is prone, laying. That's why NASM doesn't call them planks. They call them prone iso abs, because you are in a prone position, you are working your abs and you are isometrically holding. And then they call like, actually, I can't really think of any like supine example names. But anyway, supinated would be laying face up. Like if you're doing crunches, you're in a supinated position. But also your palm, if your palm is face up, that's supinated. It's easy to remember because you can be like, hey, give me soup. You know, that's what everybody who teaches this says. So that's a whole bunch of terms. Flashcard it up. I definitely recommend flashcards for this. It becomes very, very helpful. We're actually going to get into an extra credit assignment on Wednesday, which is making flashcards for this class. I will give you 5 hours of extra credit if you make flashcards for a list of muscles that I'm going to give you. And it can be as simple, by the way, as printing them, cutting them out, and gluing them onto flashcards. You don't necessarily have to write everything. But the rest of this course, after we get through the terminology stuff, is going to be spent like memorizing muscles and what they do. So I will give an extra, we're going to do an extra credit assignment where I will give hours if you make those flashcards. Just send me a picture. Some people get really creative with it, which is to somebody like me crazy. But you're totally welcome to. All right. How are we feeling, you three? How do you guys feel about all that? That terminology so far?
It's okay. I just remember the opposites. How you said.
Yeah.
Remember the opposite of everything. Memorize them in pairs. So that's how I took it.
Totally. It's so much easier when you do that.
Yeah.
It really does help. Because sometimes, and that also, when you think about like test questions too, your NASM is going to be multiple choice, right? Generally multiple choice questions, what they often do, you have the right answer, you have an opposite answer, you have a really close answer, and then usually you'll have like a random one, or sometimes they'll just throw in another close answer. So you'll get two that are similar, one that is a total opposite, and one that's a good one. And if you know how to like spot and you're like, okay, those two are opposites of each other, I'm willing to bet that this question is one of those two answers. And then, that eliminates half of them. You got a 50-50 chance of that play. There's some game theory for you when it comes to test taking. Robert, I know we were talking about like test taking at one point, right? Like that's a super helpful skill to kind of develop. But yeah, memorizing things in opposites, super helpful. Okay, we got more terms. So let's go through our planes of motion. Okay, so your planes of motion. So this is actually something I pulled up a picture of earlier, but what a plane of motion is it's these three imaginary planes that are positioned at opposite angle, like right angles to each other, and they all intersect at the dead center of the body. So they're three imaginary planes: the sagittal plane, the frontal plane, and the transverse plane. And basically what they're used for is to describe like where motion is occurring, because movement is primarily going to take place in one plane or another. Now, I do want to put an asterisk on that. Obviously, the human body rotates. There's the whole thing. We've got overactive, underactive muscles that maybe pull us at weird angles. No exercise is going to be perfectly in one plane of motion, but generally the way we like labeled things out is we treat it as if they're perfect motions. And so we've got some movements that only take place in whatever plane of motion we are talking about. So movement is going to move from that anatomic position through that plane. So you can see here, right, this guy here is being cut into an anterior and a posterior section, right? And then on here, he's being cut into a left and a right section. And here he's being cut into a superior and inferior section, right? So he's got front and back halves, side to side halves, and upper lower halves. And so that's your sagittal plane, frontal plane, and transverse plane, which I guess that's going in a different order. Hold on really quickly. Well, no, because I already sent out the email. All right, this picture is like in the wrong order. This middle one's the sagittal one. This is the frontal, this is the transverse. So the sagittal plane, right? The sagittal plane is the one that most of us tend to focus on. So I'm gonna do something kind of weird here. Robert, you've seen this before, so you are excluded for the second. But Davion, tell me 3 exercises. Name 3 exercises for me. Just 3. They can be body weight, dumbbells, whatever.
3 exercises that I do: push-ups, dips, squats.
Love it. Very good. All right, Noel, you got it a little bit rougher because there are 3 exercises that are eliminated now, but you give me 3 exercises. Name 3 exercises, Noel. Uh-oh, did we lose him? Noel, come back. Does this help? All right. All right. Well, we might be having. Hopefully, we're having not too intense technical difficulties. All right, well, here's the thing. We named 3 exercises, right? Normally what I like to do is I love to go, normally I have a class of like 20 students, right? And I will literally go through the whole class and I'll make each person do one. We'll get 20 exercises out. Nearly every one of them will be a sagittal exercise. So sagittal movements are movements that move along this direction. So push-ups, dips, squats, all of those are sagittal movements. But what about moving this way or this way, right? So here's the thing. Most people tend to put a lot of emphasis on the sagittal plane when they train. There are so many sagittal exercises out there. And we don't put a lot of emphasis on these other really important planes that our life moves us through. You know, we move laterally, we move transversely all of the time. And so it's kind of funny. Like that's one thing I always like to show people, and Nassim will say it too. We see a lot of emphasis on the sagittal plane. So let's go ahead and understand, like when we're talking about these planes of motion, it's where most of your movement occurs. And you want to think of it as like you're stuck on a track. Like that guy is being cut down the middle like this, right? And it goes this way and it goes infinitely that way. He's moving along it like this, right? So like crunches, right? When I go like this, I'm crunching forward, right? That's a sagittal movement. When I move my head up and down, that's a sagittal movement. When I do when I do bicep curls, that's a sagittal movement. When I do tricep extensions, that's a sagittal movement. Dips, right? Sagittal. Now, obviously, like dips, you know, that's a good example of where sometimes your elbows will flare out a little bit. You get a little transverse in there, you know, but we'll look at that in just a second. So the movements that occur in the sagittal plane, the 2 primary ones are going to be what are called flexion and extension, okay? So your sagittal plane bisects the body into a left and a right half. Flexion and extension are the main movements here. Now there's some special ones. There's hyperflexion or hyperextension. Hyperextension is where you just go beyond a normal range of motion. Hyperflexion is a little more rare, but that would be going beyond a range of motion in the other direction. So like I can't do it very much because I don't have like a ton of space, but like you ever see somebody who's like double jointed and their elbow like comes down here, you know, like you're like, good God, you know, like somebody who's quote unquote double jointed. That is like hyperextension of their elbow. So like if I really try to straighten that out as much as I can, that's about as close to hyperextension as I can get. Hyperflexion is the exact opposite. So if I were to go here and just squeeze that down and maybe like bring it, you know, beyond the range of motion I'm supposed to, that's hyperflexion. But those terms really aren't going to come up very much. The only time you're ever going to really hear that term is when you're in the gym and you're doing like that Roman chair where you're like bringing yourself up like this, you know, then you're doing a lot of, they call that exercise hyperextensions. Good examples of flexion and extension, right? What flexion is, and I'm going to give you the definition here. It is a bending movement between 2 joints where the angle between those joints decreases. So go back to high school geometry with those stupid protractors, right? And we would measure like angles, right? So like if I've got my arm here, right? This, if you were to take a protractor and you know, you fold one section this way and you fold the other section that way, right? This is 180 degrees, right? Flat line. Now, if I bend it halfway up, right? That's 90 degrees, right? That is 45 degrees, 30 degrees, right? So what's happening is the angle's decreasing. It went from 180 down to 90, down to 45, right? It went down. So that is a bending where the angle decreases in the sagittal plane. That is flexion. So bicep curls is, and then I refer to whatever joint I'm talking about, I would say elbow flexion, right? Tricep push down, right? That's a movement that happens in the sagittal plane as well, but a tricep is where, look, my angle is increasing, right? It's going from 20 degrees to 45 to 90 to 180, right? So there's a tricep push down. It's a sagittal movement. It's an example of what we call extension extension. And extension is a straightening movement where the angle increases. So good examples of extension include things like squats, tricep pushdowns, Supermans, right? Whereas flexion are things like hamstring curls, mountain climbers, right? Things like that. So all of those take place in the sagittal plane, but then the two primary movements we're looking at are flexion and extension, or, right, flexion and extension. Now, here's where people get into trouble, and you don't want to make this mistake. It is not direction-based. It is angle-based. So a big mistake that people will think is they'll say, like, because when I show you this example here, right, when I go flexion, extension, it makes you kind of jump to the conclusion. It's like, oh, if stuff's moving this way, if it's moving up, it's flexion. If it's moving down, it's extension. That's not true. That's a false understanding. It's based on the angle. Is the angle increasing, the angle decreasing? And here's how. Here's why that is so specific, right? Like if you again, like it's going up, it's going down, right? Flexion, extension, right? But that's not really true when you get to the spine, right? This is flexion, and I'm going down. This is extension, where I'm going up. So it's angle based, it's number based, not direction based. So don't pay attention to the direction, pay attention to the angle, right? I'm standing at 180 degrees and I'm bending to like less than 90, you know, down to maybe 90 degrees, right? So I'm performing flexion or extension, okay? So those are both sagittal plane movements. I'm moving along a plane, you know, this way, front to back. Now there are two special ones here that are in the ankle. Your ankle is a weird joint. Oh shoot, I kind of skipped ahead. Let me catch you guys up on the PowerPoints and just say the same thing I said. So terms that are described to change the actual position of the bones, right? So you've got knee flexion, right? And you got flexion of the leg, right? Leg flexion, that'd be like hip flexion. We don't really want to use just like flexion of the leg, you know, that's kind of too simple of a term, but we'd say flexion of the knee, right? So flexion, a bending movement where the angle decreases. Extension, a bending movement where the angle increases. So during elbow inflection, the forearm moves closer to the shoulder by decreasing the angle. And during elbow extension, the forearm moves away from the shoulder by increasing the angle, right? And then hyperextension is moving beyond normal range. Okay. Now we're caught up. Sorry, I went only into the notes instead of the PowerPoints. So let's look at the ankle. So now you have two special terms because your ankle is weird. Your ankle can do a lot of movements. And so you've got what is called dorsiflexion, and then you don't have an extension, but they call it plantar flexion. And it's because technically both of them are like angular decreases. So they're just angular decreases from different parts. So they kind of just both use the word flexion there, but it's still a sagittal plane movement. And here's the one that's easy to remember. Like memorize, like plantar flexion, dorsiflexion are opposites of each other. Plantar flexion is a little easy to understand because look, you're pointing your toe away, you're planting your foot. Versus dorsiflexion, you're pulling your toes back towards you. So if you think about like a gas pedal, right? Dorsiflexion is where the toe is coming up towards the shin. Plantar flexion is where the toe is going away from the shin. And so that's dorsiflexion. So when I go like this, right? And I like raise myself up onto my toes, I'm pointing my toes down. That's plantar flexion. But if I bring my toes back towards me this way, right? That's dorsiflexion. This is a term we are going to use a lot because your clients, most of your clients, it is the most common freaking overactivity that we see. Most people are great at plantar flexion and they suck at dorsiflexion. How many people have you guys, like if I told, you know, a lot of people just like stand up on one leg, most people are just going to let their, I don't know if you can even see that. Most people are just going to let their foot kind of dangle, right? They should be pulling their toes up towards them in that dorsiflexion. limited dorsiflexion is one of the biggest causes of bad squat form out there. So we often really want to train people to work on their dorsiflexion. So that's dorsiflexion, toes towards you, plantar flexion, toes away from you. All right, how are you feeling about the sagittal plane? Questions, comments, concerns? Cool, cool. Davion, Noel, are you back yet?
I've been here.
No, not you.
Yeah, I'm here.
All right, gotcha. All right, let's take a look at the frontal plane. So this is a super important plane. Sometimes I'll be honest, it can be a little confusing because you'll think of it and you know, what's important about the planes is their movement, right? Well, the frontal plane does not move front to back. That's the sagittal plane. The frontal plane actually moves side to side. So your frontal plane is stuff like this, right? And it's because you can see your front. It's dividing you into anterior and posterior sections. So it's an imaginary plane that divides you into front and back halves. The movements here are going to be abduction and adduction, right? You are adding it back to your body, or your arms are being abducted by aliens, right? And then there's also a couple special ones here. There's lateral flexion. Now this is like one of them. This is actually like, I think my favorite term just because it's a real rule breaker and it's kind of fun. But lateral flexion doesn't have an opposite. It's the only movement that doesn't have an opposite, right? You've got abduction, you got the opposite, adduction. You've got flexion, the opposite is extension. Lateral flexion doesn't have an opposite because you would actually just say left to right lateral flexion or right to left lateral flexion, which is kind of cool because like this is where you start looking at like how we are super symmetrical, right? I've got my right obliques, I got my left obliques, right? And so like I do lateral flexion here. I also do lateral flexion here. And so that is actually the same muscle, it just refers to your directions there, which I think is kind of cool. I think lateral flexion is one of my favorite terms just because it's so unique. And then you're also going to have what is called eversion and inversion. And boy, are these two terms important, and boy, are they slightly confusing. So eversion and inversion are also ankle things. So you have got plantar flexion and dorsiflexion, but you've also got eversion and inversion, which I don't know how I'm going to get my freaking camera to show you this. That is as low as my camera can go. Let's see here. Oh, there's so much sun. You know what? Here. Come here. All right. Putting you down. Okay. So here is, okay, so you've got inversion, right? Where you notice that I'm showing the bottom of my foot towards my midline. And then I've got eversion where I'm showing the bottom of my foot towards the outside, right? So inversion, eversion, inversion, eversion. Your ankle moves bottom of the foot this way, that's inverted. Bottom of the foot that way, that's everted. Those are both frontal plane movements. And if your ankle is doing a little bit of eversion and it's also doing a little bit of dorsiflexion, at the same time, well, chances are you're also going to have a little bit of rotational movement, and we're going to have a special term for that we're going to get to in a little bit. So frontal plane movements are things like side shuffling, right? That's a frontal plane movement. I'm moving side to side. Or lateral lunges. Whoa, I stepped on something. I startled myself. That's where you're going right here, right? That's a lateral lunge. Or side lateral raises, right? Or maybe like, you know, this is the dumbest exercise in the world, but side crunches, don't do those, they're dumb. But that is a frontal plane movement. They're not dumb, it just doesn't do anything, it's a waste of time. That is those are your frontal plane movements. So Abduction. So flexion was a decrease in angle. Abduction doesn't have to do that. We don't have to worry about angles with abduction or adduction. We just talk about, like, is the limb you're moving, is it moving away from your midline or is it moving toward your midline? If it's moving away from your midline, that's abduction. It's being abducted away, right? It's being abducted. So during hip abduction, right, your femur moves laterally away from the body, right? But during adduction, right, adduction would be adding it back closer to my midline. So even if I cross over my midline like this, right, it originally started over here. So even if I cross over the midline, it's like, well, yeah, this is another one of those dumb arguments where it's like, well, now technically it's moving away from your midline because it crossed over the other side. Nope. Anatomic position takes away the dumb arguments, right? So this is adduction. This is abduction. So adduction, abduction, right? Then you've got lateral flexion, which is only your spine. So this, right? Or this, that is lateral flexion. So those are two really important ones, abduction, adduction. Those are all the normal ones, right? Those are the normal frontal plane movements. But then we get the special ones. We got the ankle again, the ankle screwing everything up. And so this is movement of your heel bone either toward your midline or movement of your heel bone away from your midline, right? And so if the bottom of your foot is showing, and by the way, like, they're calling this supination and pronation here because it's really hard to do just, you actually probably noticed it even when I was demoing it. I had a really hard time just doing inversion and eversion by itself. You'll notice I was also kind of rotating a little bit. And that's because, like, what you'll often see is actually what's called supination and pronation of the foot. Just like your wrist can supinate and pronate, your ankle can supinate and pronate as well. Looks a little different, but it's the same motion. So eversion is movement away from the midline. So you can see, like, he's showing the bottom of his foot towards the outside. That's everted. And inverted is showing the bottom of the foot towards the midline. So I'm going to do this one more time, right? There's my dirty laundry. So this is inverted, and this is everted. So inverted, everted, inverted, everted. And you'll notice, remember our most important lesson from the skeletal system? See how I was also moving my thighs? It's impossible to freaking not, you know? One joint affects your other ones, right? Going back to that key concept from the skeletal system. All right, that's the frontal plane. Questions, comments, concerns? Feeling good about that one, guys? Getting our planes down? Cool. All right. The last one, the transverse plane. So this one is going to be, again, remember the whole point of the planes, right? I'm moving along the plane, right? So if it's sagittal, I'm moving along it this way. If it's frontal, I'm moving along it this way. Transverse is moving along it this way, right? Like, it is cutting me this way. So my head, right? If you were to cut my head right here, right? It would move, it would slide in this direction. My arm would slide in this direction, right? So transverse movements are the transverse plane is dividing you into upper and lower, superior and inferior halves, right? And so movements here include internal rotation, external rotation. There's the head, which is also special, right? Again, because your spine is dead center. You know, like lateral flexion, which was a special term. You also have, like, right to left rotation. We're really not going to use that term very often. You've also got these two other special ones, which are horizontal abduction and horizontal adduction. So remember, adduction means to go closer to your midline. Abduction means to go farther from your midline. Well, those are both kind of going up and down, right? Like, I'm going up, I'm going down, I'm going up, I'm going down. If I was moving horizontally, which is like this way, right? I would have horizontal close to my midline. So horizontal adduction and horizontal abduction. And those are specific just to your shoulder. Your shoulder is unique. Your scapula, very cool freaking bone. It gets its whole day in this class. And so these actually, you know, fun fact, and I was going to say this later, but your scapula does get a full day dedicated in this class. And it was my interview to get a job at Sochi. I did my interview on the scapula. And just talked about it for an hour and droned on and on and on. And they were like, ooh, that's rough. But they hired me anyways. So horizontal abduction, right? Abduct means to go away from. So I am horizontally moving away from my midline, or I am horizontally moving toward my midline. And those are both transverse plane movements as well. Then you've got, again, pronation and supination, right? Supinated, pronated. So give me soup, right? All right. So this one, you're going to see like trunk rotation, right? Or throwing, right? Golfing. I totally just swung that like a bat, which is my next one, swinging a bat. This is why I'm a terrible golfer. And so those are your transverse motions. So internal rotation, what that is it's movement along the longitudinal axis, AKA like a rotary movement, toward the midline. So it's a rotary movement towards the midline. So during shoulder internal rotation, right, your humerus is moving toward the midline. It was external, now it's internal, right? Now, generally, when we're actually exercising, right, you'll see people do that. You know, sometimes you'll see people at the gym, they'll lay on their side and they'll do those external rotations. That movement, by the way, is freaking great for you and everyone should do it. But sometimes you'll also see people just grab like a cable and they'll just do little like rotary movements here, right? They'll just do this little external rotation. That is a great, great, great movement for your rotator cuff. Most people spend their time like this in internal rotation. Most people. I would not be surprised if it's everybody in this call, myself included. Here's how you can tell if you have a little bit of too much internal rotation. Robert, remember you were asking me the other day, like if there's other assessments? Here is a cheap, dirty assessment that is like super, super simple. So just go ahead and shake it out and just relax a little bit and let yourself sit. Now, do you notice how my thumbs are facing my midline, right? They're kind of neutral. They're kind of going in an angle like this. Ideally, they should be sitting back here, facing straight forward. That is a neutral, unrounded shoulder position. But if I let my shoulders sit naturally, the way that is kind of comfortable, my thumbs start facing each other, right? That is an assessment that you can do without even putting someone through an assessment. You can just look at them as they walk through the gym. And that shows that they have slight shoulder rounding. That is an ever so slightly internally rotated shoulder, right? My internal rotators, which in this case would be my teres minor, teres major, and my pectoralis minor. Both of those muscles are kind of pulling and causing that internal rotation to happen. So I need to stretch those things. So internal rotation is rotary movement toward the midline. A good example includes, and it's literally, the exercise is called cable internal rotation. So you would grab a cable machine and you would internally rotate like that. External rotation is movement along the longitudinal axis away from the midline. So that would be grabbing a cable machine going from this way and pulling it externally. Those are really good. Now, sometimes people get confused, like newbies often think that this and this is the same as this and this, but they're two totally different movements, right? My shoulders at my side rotating like this during this version, but my shoulders up here moving my humerus this way, that is totally different. It's not a fly, it's a rotation. So those are your internal and external. Then you do have the special ones that we just started talking about, which is horizontal abduction, movement of a limb horizontally away from the midline, and horizontal adduction, movement of a limb horizontally toward the midline, right? So that's horizontal abduction. So a horizontal abduction going this way, right? Good example would be like a reverse fly or a row, right? Rowing, right? I may have my elbow bent right here, but it's this motion, right? It's the same as a reverse fly. It's just whether or not I'm moving my elbow at the same time or not. Horizontal adduction, same thing, right? That'd be like a chest fly or a bench press, right? Push-ups, if your arms are flared out. Depends on what type of push-ups you're doing. If you're doing like kind of traditional push-ups, it's really it's some horizontal adduction. But sometimes you'll do like what they call like military push-ups or like narrow grip push-ups, where you'll do like this version, and that's really just like, that's shoulder just flexion. So it kind of depends. And both of them are really good. I like both types of push-ups. You know, I don't think one's better than the other. I think one targets your triceps a little bit more and your deltoid, and the other one targets more like your straight pectoralis. Then you get your rotary movements, right? Pronate. No, it's funny. They're not in your notes. They don't really come up. But pronation and supination are rotational movements, right? So pronation and supination, either supinating, producing force, right? Or pronating, reducing force. And so that's what we're going to see there. Now, pronation and supination is going to be most commonly seen in the ankle. I mean, don't get me wrong, this is pronation and supination for sure. But the most common version that we're going to spend just so much time talking about, when we get to the ankle, we're just going to hammer it for a little while, is when you see a combination. Remember, ankle does the frontal plane movement of eversion, and you're doing the transverse plane movement of external rotation, and you're going to do the sagittal plane movement of just a little bit of dorsiflexion. When you do all three things together, we call that pronation of the foot. And so let me show you what that looks like. So pronation of the foot is where, God, okay. I give up. I'm tired of you guys not being able to see. So, so we look here, right? If I evert the foot, so I'm going to keep my toes pointing straight forward, but I'm going to show the bottom of my foot away. God, it's cramping my foot. And then if I do a little bit of external rotation, so now I'm also turning it away. And if I do a little bit of dorsiflexion, so I'm just going to pull my toes back towards me slightly so that it flattens the inside part in. Notice how that totally changes my knees too, by the way, right? Like my knees are caving in. This is pronation of the foot. You'll see people run like this. You'll see this over pronation. So let me show you what I say. Ankle pronation. Take a look here. That's pronation, right? They are flattening that inside portion down, right? Actually, that's a really good one too. See that right there? Their normal ankle would be here, but they are externally rotating just slightly, and they're showing the bottom of this outside part. They're showing that further away. So that is sort of what we're seeing there, and you'll see it, right? You'll see it in some people who have like a low arch. They'll have like a flat foot, but they don't actually have flat feet. They weren't born with flat feet, but they developed it slowly over time by tightening up the calf muscles and weakening up their shin muscles. Woo! Look at that one, right? That's some serious pronation. So this is going to cause all types of problems, especially like in the foot. But it's also going to cause problems in the knee, and it's going to cause problems in the hip, and it's probably going to cause problems in the back. And then it could even lead to things like shoulder impingement someday. So there's most of our terms for the planes of motion. How you guys feeling about the transverse plane? Pretty good? More terms, I know. We were like working up to this day. All right, we got a couple special scapula ones. So remember I said the scapula is important, right? It's a unique bone. It's got some unique jobs. These aren't really planes of motion situations. These are kind of just your scapula doing its own thing. So your scapular movements that you've got, luckily they're pretty easy to understand. The names, the word kind of means what it is. So your scapular movements are going to occur on that, scapula, your shoulder blade, right? And so you have got scapular retraction, right? Which is this, pulling your shoulder blades back, pinching them together, right? That's scapular retraction. You're retracting them backwards. And then you got scapular protraction, which is rounding them forwards, right? So retraction, protraction. Then you got scapular elevation, which is this, and you got scapular depression, which is that. So you actually don't have much scapular depression, right? Like here's me sitting neutral, here's me doing maximal scapular depression, right? Really, just not that much movement. It's only about 2 degrees. But scapular elevation, oh, good Lord, do we have tons of that. You've got muscles that are in charge of all of these things. Here's why knowing these movements are really important. Honestly, it's not that important, like, to deal with your scapular movements by themselves if your scapula is just moving the way it's supposed to. The problem is that your scapula determines how your shoulder joint moves. So there's a difference between your scapular joint and your shoulder joint. That's the difference between what's called your shoulder girdle, which is this. That's your scapula. I don't know, see it's showing that there. There we go. So see how the yellow part here? That's your shoulder girdle, right? It's your collarbone and your scapula. And there's a difference between that and your shoulder joint, which is the actual shoulder joint that you're kind of thinking of. It's where your scapula meets your humerus. So this and this are different between the connection to this and this. And this takes a beating. It is often where you hear about like shoulder impingements, labrum tears, shoulder dislocations, right? So all of those things happen if your collarbone and your shoulder, your scapula don't act the way that they're supposed to. It affects how your arm moves. And when your arm can't move the way it's supposed to, you end up like trying to raise your arm and then it gets tight and you can't move it up any higher. So then you start doing this, right? When it should be able to move naturally all the way out, right? You start raising your arm up overhead, you get stuck, and then you arch your back, right? So your body finds a different place to get that movement from. That's why all these terms are so important. Because like if I were looking at somebody, I told them to raise their arms up overhead, they should be able to raise them 90 degrees, no problem. But if instead they do this, right? Are they actually performing shoulder flexion? No, they're performing shoulder flexion a little, and they're also doing back hyperextension, which is going to move their pelvis into a rotational movement downward, right? They're going to get an anterior tilt. Don't worry, we're going to get to all that later. But that's why all this terminology is so important, because like when I look at when someone moves a certain way, I'm analyzing, it's like, oh man, that's not what I meant. It's like, all right, I want you to squat. And then they do some weird variation and they're like, I did it. And it's like, yeah, you did something that looks like a squat. You did the elephant seal. I wanted an elephant, so we're almost done. We got our, look at that. We got a page of notes here at the bottom. It's just blank space. These notes look longer than they actually are. All right, let's take a look at our last little bit here. I know there was a lot of motions, but the last little thing we're gonna look at for today is we are gonna look at our muscle actions. So yesterday, we learned agonist, which is the main muscle to a movement, antagonist, which is the opposite muscle to a movement. So if I said horizontal abduction, the agonist is my medial deltoid, right? And the antagonist is whatever performs horizontal adduction, which is actually my lat muscle. So you got this giant lat muscle fighting this little itty bitty bacon strip. You can understand why people struggle with this motion so much. So now we got to look at, like, one of the things I said yesterday. I think it was you, Robert. Maybe it was yeah. I think it was you were asking about like if what a muscle does, like when is it an agonist, right? And it's when a muscle is shortening, that's when the muscle is an agonist, right? When the muscle's contracting, it's acting as an agonist. When the muscle's relaxing, that's because the antagonist in the other direction's now pulling. So it has to relax, it has to lengthen. So my bicep is the agonist during flexion, and my tricep is the agonist during extension. When I'm performing flexion, the bicep is shortening. That's why it's the agonist. My tricep is lengthening. That's why it's the antagonist. And then the opposite is true when I go in the other direction, right? My tricep is now shortening and my bicep is lengthening. Agonist, antagonist, right? So that is where we need to look at our types of contractions. Your muscles, they don't just contract when they're shortening. They're contracting in all directions. So we have 3 types of contractions. You are going to see 2 over terms. Don't worry about this first one. But muscle actions, the various types of contractions that your muscles make. There's 2 types. There's isotonic contractions and there's isometric contractions. Isotonic means a contraction during movement. I don't know, you might get a question about that, but honestly, like that term is really not that important. This is just, again, like scientists trying to get it down to 2. Honestly, this first one is just not a very important distinction. But isotonic contractions are contractions that involve shortening or lengthening. They involve movement, right? So the important terms are these 2. Eccentric contractions and concentric contractions, or concentric contractions, right? So eccentric muscle actions, right? These occur when a muscle is developing tension when it is lengthening. So the muscle's being stretched out. It's contracting, but it's contracting for less force than gravity or whatever resistance you're applying to it, right? So Davion, you're a big calisthenics guy, right? That's your thing, isn't it? Bodyweight exercise?
I do everything really, but I stay on the calisthenic side though.
Okay, yeah. So did you start, could you just do pull-ups naturally, or did you have to start by doing negatives?
Well, I could start doing pull-ups. I just did what I can do, but I make sure I did them the proper way. So I maintained that part, doing it accurately.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. See, I couldn't do a pull-up at first. I couldn't like naturally do it. But the first time I ever went, you know, my body was like, "Are you kidding me? Look at how long your arms." You know.
Right.
You know?
Right.
My body was like, "We're not having this."
Right.
So I had to teach my body how to do pull-ups over time.
Yeah.
So here's the thing. When you're teaching people how to do pull-ups, a lot of times what you'll start with are what are called negative pull-ups. And what a negative pull-up is where you'll actually help yourself up over the bar. So you'll start here instead of starting with straight arms. And then what you do is you slowly lower yourself down back to the ground. And then you help yourself up again, and then you slowly lower yourself. So you're slowly doing the lowering part of a pull-up because you can't do the pulling part of a pull-up yet. And what that does is that gets you better and better at it, and you slowly grow your strength. What you're doing is you are lengthening the muscles, your lats, as you're going down. That is the eccentric part of a pull-up. It's the lengthening. In this situation, I'm trying to develop tension, but I'm developing less tension. Like I weigh 170 pounds, right? So I'm developing less than 170 pounds worth of tension, which is why my muscle is lengthening. So that's what an eccentric contraction is. It's a lengthening, right? Whereas if I were to overcome gravity and pull myself up over the bar, that would be concentric. My muscle's shortening and it's generating more tension than whatever resistive force, in this case, gravity, is applying, right? So eccentric contractions move in the same direction as the resistance. Concentric contractions move in the opposite direction of a resistance. And then you have your third category, which are isometric contractions, right? Isometric contractions are where there is no movement. You're not lengthening, you're not shortening, you're staying put. A wall sit, right? I forgot about this. I love these 3 pictures. All right, this is gonna be great. This is one of my favorite, this is like literally my 3 favorite slides, probably in the whole Sochi program. So this guy right here, he's like allergic to cats. So he's like, all right, I'm going to eccentrically move this cat gently away from my body. So he is lowering the cat down, right? That's eccentric. He is lengthening his bicep. So the muscle lengthens because the contractile force is less than the resistive force. So this cat weighs, I don't know, 5 pounds, right? He is generating, let's say, 4 pounds of force in his muscle. So then the cat weighs more than the force he's generating, and that's going to pull his muscle apart and lengthen it, right? This is sometimes known as the negative portion of a rep, right? So eccentric actions occur when a muscle is lengthening. It lengthens because the forces generated are less than the resistance. So the muscle is lengthening. It is a force reduction. So when we refer to this as force reduction, when we're talking about this, in the world of training, and this is your guys' first, the two of you, this is your first introduction to actually how to write programs. A lot of times we will designate the tempo that we want our clients to lift at, and we do it by telling them how many seconds we want in each part of the contraction. So when we're writing tempo out, if we wrote a 4-2-1 tempo, the first number is always the eccentric part of the lift. The middle number is always the isometric part of the lift. And the third number is always the concentric part of the lift. So in terms of a 4-2-1 tempo, right? If I were referring to a squat, right? I would eccentric, I'd generate less force than resistance. So I had a barbell on my back, right? And it weighs 100 pounds, right? Then I weigh 100, like I said, I weigh 174 pounds. So that's 274. So if my glutes generate 250 pounds of tension, that's less tension than it would need to overcome this, I will lower down to the ground. So if I move 1, 2, 3, 4, right? That slow tempo on the way down, that's the eccentric portion, right? So eccentric is always the first number. Now that makes sense in a squat, right? Because I start, whenever I'm doing my reps, I start with the eccentric portion. But that's not always how it is. Like, let's say you have like dumbbells in your hand, right? And you get onto a bench and you pop the dumbbells up and you lay down on the bench and you're gonna do your first rep and you were doing a 4-2-1 tempo. It's not that you would go 1, 2, 3, 4. It doesn't go in order. It goes eccentric, isometric, concentric. So the lowering down would be 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the isometric would be the 2 seconds. So 1, 2, and then you would push 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 1. Okay, that's what the 4-2-1 tempo refers to. If it was a 2-0-2 tempo, that would be 1, 2, no pause, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. That's a medium tempo. And a fast tempo would be super explosive, fast in all 3 directions. So eccentric actions are when a muscle is lengthening, and it is the 4 in the 4-2-1, right? It's the first number. Then this guy's clearly a puppy fan. So concentric muscle actions are going to occur when a muscle is developing tension when it's shortening. So he is going to shorten his muscles to overcome a resistive force. So he is bringing the puppy towards him. So the muscle is shortening. That's a concentric action. It's the lifting phase. It's the contraction that we generally think of when we think of it, but they're all contractions. You can think of this as accelerating. It's a force acceleration situation. He's like, I want to accelerate that puppy towards my face. You can also think of this as force production, right? So again, concentric actions are the opposite. They occur when a muscle develops tension while it's shortening. The muscle shortens because the amount of force that it's generating is greater than the resistive force, right? So you can think of that as force production. You are producing force. In our numbers, right, it's the third number that's listed. So this was eccentric. This is concentric. So going back to that squat, right? I went down 1, 2, 3, 4. Maybe I held for 2, and I would come up for 1. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 1. That's my 4-2-1 tempo. Then we got our last one, which is that isometric contractions. Now, isometric contractions are where you are going to involve no movement. You are trying to keep something at arm's length, such as an alligator. I love how like they also made his hair stand up on end. Like, so this occurs when a muscle is generating equal force to a resistance. So your body is going to stay in the same position. Your muscle is going to stay in the same length, right? So if your force is equal, right, then it doesn't have to change length. If you were doing like a plank, that's an isometric. If you were doing a wall sit, that's an isometric, right? These are used to stabilize your body. So we've got force reduction, force production, and force stabilization. And then when we label that out in terms of tempo, this is the middle number. We call that the 2 in the 4-2-1 tempo. So 4-2-1 tempo would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 1, or it would be 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, not direction based, it's contraction based. So there are some special terms here, but I didn't put them in your notes. There are isokinetic muscle actions. That is where your muscle is contracting at a very set speed. So this usually uses like a very specific piece of equipment. But you'll see these like kind of interesting like machines. Like I'll pull up a picture here. Shopping? No. So, see this machine right here? It's kind of cool. It can put force. It's not angle based, because what ends up happening is like, you know, a lot of times when you first start contracting, it starts with your quadriceps, and then when you get towards like the end, it kind of finishes with your rectus femoris. So this machine here allows you to contract at a very specific tempo the whole time. They're kind of cool. They're often used to like retrain the body. Like if you have bad lifting habits and you're in a physical therapy situation, they can use those machines. It's just in here to kind of, if anybody in here ever ends up in a PT situation. But all right, let's go ahead and summarize everything, right? So the study of biomechanics, that's our main thing we talked about today. It's how the internal and external forces affect how we move, you know, how our body moves around. In order to be able to understand how we move, we have to have a very, very, very specific language to speak with these various anatomic locations, right? They're all going to be based on that anatomic position of feet pointing forward, at hip width, palms facing forward. That's our anatomic position. That way, it takes any of the guesswork out. In the latter half of this class, after the midterm, I'm going to be teaching you, you know, I want you to learn that the gastrocnemius muscle, right, your calf muscle, concentrically accelerates, meaning it's the agonist, during plantar flexion. And so like by saying all of those specific terms, it sounds like a really wordy, complicated way to speak, but honestly, it takes all the guesswork out and makes it much easier to understand. You know that it is in charge of this and it doesn't do anything else. That way, if you see somebody who, you know, if you get a client who like walks into the gym and they're like walking in and they're like, you know, in athletic shoes, but they're walking around like a freaking werewolf, you know, and they're just like, hi, and you look at them and you go, holy crap, those are the world's most overactive calf muscles. You know that you need to strengthen the antagonist to that. So then you would just reach into your brain and go, all right, well, if the calves concentrically accelerate plantar flexion, which muscle concentrically accelerates dorsiflexion? Oh, the anterior tibialis. So you'd be like, we need to foam roll your calves. We need to stretch your calves. We need to strengthen your anterior tibialis. That all sounds really complicated at first, but trust me, it becomes second nature. That's what all those overactive, underactive muscle conversations that we've had in the past. And I know Noel and Davion, we haven't talked too much about that just yet, but that's what we spend so much of our time doing. If I look at somebody and they're like this, I need to remember what makes them do this, and then I need to do that, you know? Obviously, I don't want them to get stuck like that, but I do want to get them back to neutral. All right. That's it. We did it. And we actually did it on time, which is surprising because normally I get a little wordy doing this one. Do you guys have any questions? Any of those terms that we went over today where you're like, you know what? I want to ask you now because that one wasn't 100% clear. I know it was a lot of terms, but is any of them like any that I moved fast that were just like, yeah, I'm just not visual. I'm not visualizing one or anything like that?
Not at all.
All right, very cool.
Yeah, I think I was having a lot of trouble with the eccentric and concentric, especially like when it comes to squat, because like you would think this, the direction of it or the degree of the angle of it, but it's totally different, when
Yeah.
you got to think of the lengthening of the muscle, not the degree of which you're going. And I would always have a hard time remembering that instead.
That's the thing. Yeah, it's so easy to go direction based, because but that would make it, then we wouldn't have like a standard version. So we'd have all these exceptions to rules. We'd be like, oh, it goes in this order. Well, except in that movement, and we don't want to have any of that. We want to take, we don't want to have any, well, except for the, so we eliminate that by having, it be, contraction based. So yeah, that's great. That's awesome. No exceptions to any rules. All right. So guys, homework number 2 is going to be up today. It's going to cover the muscular system, and you're going to see a bunch of these terms. What I recommend, and what people usually say in the past, is just pull your homework up, pull your homework up and have your notes written just like right there. And don't worry about how long it takes you, and just look through those. And just like, a lot of the questions on the homework are going to be like, blank refers to a position behind another position, right? So behind, posterior, right? So you're just going to see a lot of terms like that. So it's just going to be a lot of like getting you to flex those muscles and get used to using that terminology. That's why I always say like flashcards are so helpful. Again, I say it all the time. I don't like memorization, but it is a part of like what we do. You got to memorize the alphabet before you can put letters together to make a word. So this is where I wouldn't call it memorizing, but I would call it like learning how to talk the talk. And that way you can walk the walk. All right. So I'll let you guys out of here, and I'll see you guys on Monday. You got all weekend. Get those homeworks up to, get them up to 99s. All right. Oop. What do I have open still? Where's my record button? All right. See you later, everybody.